Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech olam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
So here we are in Parshat Lech Lecha here. So this is, remember, after we talked about how Lot separates from Abram and decides to head towards Sodom, etc. And after that, God speaks to Abram, and one of the things he says to him, he makes some promises to him, and he says, "Kum hitalech ba'aretz, arise, walk around the land, le'orka u'lerochba, to its length and to its breadth, ki lacha etnena, before to you I will give it." For you, I will give it. And of course, Lot has just picked out one thing, right? But God is saying to Abram, you're going to get everything. So we had a comment on that in Torah Tamima a little bit before. Kum hitalech, right? Arise, walk around. Tanya, there is again, Tanya, we've had this word quite often. It is taught, and we're talking about a very early source, right, of halacha. Hamocher, one who sells shvil, a path, l'chaveiro, to his neighbor or to his fellow. Kevan shehalach bo kanao. Once he walks in it, once this neighbor, the buyer walks in it, he has acquired it, right? There's this issue of transfer, right? At what point and what responsibilities go along and what rights and privileges go along in terms of the transfer of property from one source to another source. And as a subject, that's sort of a very interesting topic, and I'm sure it's one that consumes laws of all countries considerably. The idea of transition, right? Interesting. My tama. So what's the reason? Why so? Dichtiv, because as it is written, kum hitalech ba'aretz, this verse that we are reading here, arise, walk around the land, le'orka u'lerochba, to its length and to its width, ki lecha etena, for to you I am giving it. So you can see that from the way in which the language flows here, and the fact that it mentions that Abraham should go to its length and breadth, in other words, the entire area, and that for you I will give it, right? Or I wish to give it. And, or let's say, I mean, it really is a transfer, as it were, of property. And this is from the Yerushalmi, Talmud Yerushalmi, Kiddushin, the Tractate Kiddushin, Perek Aleph. This is chapter 1, Halacha Gimel, Halacha 3. Right. So let's take a look here. And of course, just before we get into this further, clearly, this transition is a huge topic because we are dealing with that very issue right now in terms of the Jewish claim to the land of Israel and the fact that there are groups of the Palestinians, if we want to identify them as such, the people who lived there before under the Turkish rule for centuries, right? And who are disputing that claim, right, to the death. At any rate, let's make sure I've got the place. All right. V'huva inyanze, he says this subject that we're talking about is brought gamba bavle. Also, I told you this. The selection he chose, Torah Tamima chose, was from the Yerushalmi, but it is also mentioned in the Babylonian Talmud, Baba Batra, the tractate Baba Batra, Kuf Aleph, page 100a. So why doesn't he pick it, right? Because generally we see the Babylonian Talmud as having a little bit greater authority as a source of law, right? Ach beshinui lashon. But there's a sort of he says, it doesn't define it here, but he says that the language in the Bavli is in a different way, benogeh la pasuk shelefanenu, regarding the pasuk, the verse that is before us. And I have not done that research to see what it says in the Bavli in Baba Kama, page 100a. I confess, at any rate, that to that level of depth, I'm not studying with you right now. I'm just trying to get a sense right now. So that would be a subject of further study to see exactly what it does say and in what sense. At any rate, we're being told even though it is mentioned in the Bavli, it isn't done in as clear a way, I guess he's saying, as it is done here. Excuse me one moment. Okay. All right. Ulachin hetaknu Yerushalmi, and he says, and for that reason we copied from the Yerushalmi, the way the Yerushalmi handles this halacha. Umevo'ar b'gemara sham, right? He says, he's referring now in the Yerushalmi itself. It's clarified there, dehaino rak bishvil shel kramim, that it's limited to a path that is in a vineyard. We aren't talking about paths in general. We are talking there specifically about a path in a vineyard, shemeyuchad lehelech, that is designated for walking. In other words, it's a path that is through a vineyard that is for the purpose of, specifically for the purpose of walking through. Aval b'sha'ar derech, right? But other kinds of paths, hamiyuchad ktsat letashmish acher, that might be used for another purpose. In other words, if it is a path, let's say, that is being used in order to prune the vineyard, right? In other words, to get access to the vineyard. I think this is what he's talking about here. It isn't the whole purpose of this path is a way of transferring through or going through the vineyard in this particular case. But paths obviously are within fields for other purposes as well. In other words, to service the field, etc. Eino nikne behiluch. They are not. Just walking down the path isn't going to acquire it for the buyer. Rak bechazaka, but only in something called a halachic concept called chazaka. I believe the translation of that of chazaka is an English word that isn't, at least in my usage, that common. Usufruction, meaning that it's like when you say possession is 9/10 of the law, that is part of what's going on here. In other words, chazakah here in this particular context means you've used it a number of times. In other words, one has to know that the person who's acquired it has used this path a good number of times, not just one time. That's not going to do it, but the fact that there is an assumption, as it were, made that this is this person's path. And this concept of chazakah is a fairly major concept within halacha, which has to do with legal, in a sense, a legal presumption that is more than simply a legal presumption, I would say, really has a status of ownership, right? So, for example, if you use something 3 times, very often I believe it has to do with either 3 years, like if you're on a property for 3 years, then you used it, and nobody has questioned your right to use that land, and it's not that and anyone else makes claim to it, unless they themselves can prove that they have actually gone through a legal process of acquiring that, all right, you have the right. The assumption is you, in fact, do own that land. So there's the whole issue of ownership and transfer of ownership and what exactly ownership involves, etc. I mean, this is actually a great subject for deeper thought and working out. Okay. Ukemosh, okay, okay, umikol shekain, all the more so, sadot v'karkaot. In other words, we talk even the more so when it comes to fields, not just a path, but a field, v'karkaot, and land, real estate is what he's talking about, right? That it isn't just a question of this kind of going through one time. Right? For afal and despite the fact that Kan Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that if we're looking at the language, right, the Holy One, blessed be He, said, Kum hithalech ba'aretz, He says to Abram, arise and go through the land. So it's like he's going through it one time, right? Etc., etc. Kilacha etnena, for to you I am giving it, right? Which does sound like ownership, right? Latet. Ach ein hakavana, but the purpose here in this particular context in this verse is not, the intent is, shahalicha hazot, that uh, this going through the land of Abram's, tiyeh mishum kinyan, that the intention of it was the actual acquisition of the property. In other words, Abraham walking through the land wasn't the actual moment of acquisition. Ella, however, mishum chavivute de Abraham ka'amar lechein. But it was because of how much he loved Abraham, that God loved Abraham, and this is why he said this to him. Why? Because if he loves Abraham, he is also going to be concerned. God is also going to be concerned about Abraham's descendants. Right? Kedei, and this was in order, shehiyeh Noach lichvosh levanav, so that it would be Noach, easy, maybe easy for his descendants to conquer it, to acquire it, to gain dominion over it, right? Klomar, that is to say, and just trying to, again, dig a little bit deeper and understand exactly in what sense. Shelo yeh reshut laval hadin, that they should not, that someone who was contesting it, right? It should not be, he should not able, someone who was going to contest Israel's ownership of the land, lachalot birushat Yisrael, right? To challenge, right, the possession of the Jewish people, et haaretz, the land, lomar, to say, shehen gozlinota, that they are actually stealing it. They're stealing the land of Israel. This is so interesting, right? Here we are looking at something that, of course, is exactly what's going on now, right? So we have this biblical text and an understanding that there was a divine moment right here where the Jewish people have this profound right to the land of Israel. And not that at the moment when Abraham walked through it, did he possess it, but in fact, it was by walking through that property, by walking over the land of Israel, he was, in a sense, laying claim to it for his descendants, Lachen, and for this reason, Hikdim HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, began Lahanchil Ota Lo Meforash. He needed to allow him to possess it explicitly. In other words, there's an explicit statement on the part of the divine that Abraham should, in fact, in the future, right, be his descendants would, in fact, possess the land. And the fact that it was being mentioned now, right, it wasn't just a matter of the Jewish people going in under Joshua and conquering the land of Israel, but that, in fact, there was a claim to the land very early on from the actual onset of the Jewish people, and in this language that we see right now. For us, and for that reason, Keshi Yirshu Yisrael et haaretz, that when in fact Israel would in fact inherit the land, Yishu b'Torah Yerusha, Torat Yerusha, they should possess it by the law, right, of inheritance, that it was something they inherited. Again, all concept of transfer of ownership, right? V'ien prate dinze, and examine, if you want to know further about this, details of this particular law, b'choshen mishpat, we're referring now to the Shulchan Aruch, or the Tur, right? Siman Kitzav. So in the Choshen Mishpat, under chapter 192, there is details about the laws involved in this kind of inheritance by usage, etc. Right? Okay. Going on. Le orka or le rochba, right? So to its length and to its breadth. Tanya, there is again an early source, right? This isn't legal. This is more of a literary source, right? Amar le HaKadosh Baruch Hu leMoshe, the Holy One, blessed be He, said to Moses, Chaval, it's a pity, al da'avdin velo mishtakin. It's a pity about those who are lost, who are no longer around, velo mishtakin, and they're no longer here. They're lost and they're no longer around. What are we talking about? Hare kama pamim. This has to do now with trusting God. That's what we're really talking about. We'll see. Hare, indeed. Kama pamim. There were several times. Nigleti al havot, where I revealed myself to the patriarchs. Velo hirharu achar midotai, and they did not question my qualities. But again, clarifying. Amarti Avram, I said to Abraham, Kum hithalech ba'aretz, arise, right, and go out through the land, le'orka u'lerochba, to its length and its breadth. Ki lacha etnena, for you will I be giving it. Ukeshebikesh makom likbor et Sarah. However, when he sought to find a place to bury Sarah, lo matzah, he wasn't able to find it. And of course, this was in Hebron, in the land of Israel. He wasn't able to find it ad shekana ba'arba'amot shekel kesef, until he actually acquired it through the purchase of 400 shekels of silver. And the point here is that if he owned the land, why did he have to spend so much money for a burial place for Sarah? Why didn't he turn around and say, God, you gave me this place. Why do I have to spend all this money now? That's the point, right? And he didn't question my qualities. Never questioned it. And this is from the Babylonian Talmud in Sanhedrin, page 111a. Right, okay, so on the one hand, of course, God had told him to go, to essentially live a nomadic existence and journey through the entire length and breadth of the land of Israel. And yet he did, even though he said he was giving it to him, Abram did not question it, that it was being given to him in the final analysis of ownership, right? And he had to cough up 400 shekels of silver, a lot of money, by the way. Okay. Going on, here we are. Ma'amar zeh, this particular statement, right? Ba b'tshuva, its initial statement, remember it says God said this to Moses, right? It's a pity that there are people who aren't around anymore and they aren't to be found, right? So why was he saying it to Moses? That's what we're getting at. Al divrei Moshe, when Moses said, Moses' words, she'amar lakadosh baruch hu, when he said to the Holy One, blessed be He, this is in Exodus, all right? And before we go on, I'll tell you, right? First of all, Moses, as you know, is not eager to go to speak to Pharaoh and give him the message that he is to let the Jewish people, the Israelites, go free. He's not eager, but finally he does, right? After a whole bunch of give and take, he goes. And what does Pharaoh do after he approaches? He says, oh, the Israelites are lazy. We're going to take away, they're going to have to get their own straw to make the bricks. In other words, I'm going to make it even harder for them now. And Moses comes back to God and says, this is in Exodus, Ume'az bati, quoting, and since I came, right, from the time I came, El Paro, to Pharaoh, Ledaber, right, Beshimcha, to speak in your name, he made worse, he did worse for this people, right, etc. So as he says, this is at the end of Parsha Shmot, Exodus. V'heshiv lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the Holy One, blessed be He, responded to him, replied to him, Chaval avaidat. This is not a quote now, right? This is just understood in the midrash that God said to him, Chaval, it's a pity, al avaidat avot, the fact that the patriarchs are lost, they're no longer around, shelo hiru achar midotai, because they didn't question my qualities. Va'ata tiharher, right? But you're questioning them, right? You're saying, why did I do this to you? Questioning. V'nogel lemidat Yitzchak, and he's saying the example with regard to Isaac, right? Bazeh regarding this, Yitba'er lekaman. We're gonna let you know. It's going to be clarified later on. The Parsha Toldot, in the Parsha of Toldot, which deals, of course, with Isaac, etc., and Rebecca, etc. The pasuk regarding the verse, Gur ba'aretz hazot, live in this land, listen in this land. And of course, there were famines, and he had to look for water, etc., etc. So, Yaakov, and regarding Jacob, Lekaman, later on, Rosh Perek Vayetze, at the beginning of Parsha Vayetze, but pasuk in the verse, Haaretz asher ata shochev aleha, the land upon which you lie. Right, he's going to give it to him. He says that to them. Uvenogel ledibur hakashesh Moshe, and regarding the harsh words of Moses, right? Nivar im Nivaer, we will explain, God willing, im Hashem, bimkomo, in its context, in its place, sof Parshat Shemot, when we get to the end of the Parsha of Shemot. V'Iyen Baba Batra, and you see further in Baba Batra, Takte Baba Batra, Tetvav, page 15, Bet B, Ba Tochen Agada Zo, the content of this particular Agadata, this particular story, whatever, and however you want to say, legend, right? Le'inyan acher, it's used in a different context. Vehine, and in fact, so Musaf, we don't know what that context is. We'll have to wait until we get to the end of Parshat Shemot. But at any rate, he goes on to say, Vehine, and in fact, the Musaf le Parshat Shkalim, in the Musaf service on Shabbos, right, on Parshat Shkalim, when this is before Purim, Shkalim is the very first one of the special Shabbatot that precede Pesach, but Shkalim is the very first one, and it precedes Purim, right? Ita, this is in the traditional service where there are what are called piyutim, liturgical poems that are added to the service. Generally speaking, we don't put them in our tradition now because they add to the length of the service, but they do exist in the traditional prayer book, right? In these piyutim, these liturgical poems. Ita, there is a poem that says, Zachor shkale Ephron, remember the shekels of Ephron, asher shakal av, which the father measured out. And of course, we're referring to that of the patriarch Abraham. B'michpal Hebron, in the cave, this is the Machpelah, using the word a little bit different, normally refer to it as the Machpelah, but Michpal Hebron means this cave of Machpelah in Hebron. Ulichora, and on the surface, Eino Mavuar, it's not clear, right? So in other words, we're asking God to have mercy to us on the basis of something that Abraham did. And it simply talks about the shekels of Ephron. Ephron was the name of the person who owned the land from whom Abram had to buy it, right? Purchase it, right? He says it's not so clear. Ma zachut hu bazeh. What was the benefit? What was his zachut? What was his worthiness regarding this that we're using and saying to God, please remember what Abram did in such a special way, right? Ulefi agadazo, but according to this legend that we just read about, mekuvan hanyan ma'od, we now understand it very well, right? Because of what we said, that God was saying. It's a pity that Abram isn't around because he never questioned my qualities, despite the fact that he had to purchase the land that I told him I was giving him. Shegadol zchuto, that his worthiness was great. Sheshilem bekesef maleh, because he paid the full price. He didn't bargain with Ephron. He just gave him the full price, right? V'lo hir'er achar midotav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And at the same time, he was not questioning the qualities of the Holy One, basically. As we just explained. So that will be it for today. And I'm going to stop the share. And any thoughts and comments about what we did today before I stop the recording? Okay. Yes, Harlan, you look like you're about to say something.
Yeah, I was wondering how Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob got along with the Hittites and the Canaanites and so forth. They were
Mhm.
living right with them. How did they get
Mm.
along with them?
So it's a good question. So we know that Abram had some friends, right? Some compatriots, you might say, who actually helped him. I think Eshkol and Aner, these were people who were not Israelites per se. Um, it was not the time, we're told in the text as well, that there's this thought that the people, those Canaanite nations who were admittedly doing terrible things, had not at that point done all the terrible things to a point where the scale was going to tip against them, where God would want to destroy them. So basically, it would seem, Harlan, that Abram got along as well as he could, right? So,
Hmm.
and I think there was a lot of respect for him too, Harlan. I mean, it's an interesting, in a way, a fascinating question that you're asking, because when he comes to buy that cave at the Machpelah, right, he is told by those people that he is a prince among them. So he had gained a tremendously fine reputation at that particular point.
Hmm.
Okay. But I don't feel I'm in a position to really fully analyze and answer your question. It is an interesting notion. Me, did you want to say something?
No, I'm
Okay.
just impressed with how Torah Tamima goes and expands upon the text
Right.
in terms of the real estate.
Yes, I know. Well, of
It's
course,
it's quite remarkable.
right. He's
Uh,
reflecting on how the
well, it's a
Talmud.
matter of precedent. In other words, yes, yes. So it's nice to see it drawn together, I guess is the way to put it.
Right, right. I agree. Right, how he's able to synthesize both the agadic and the halachic elements that are there to be found in the text,
Yes,
which is exactly what he's trying
yes.
to do. Yes. All right,
Yep.
so I'm going to stop the recording for now.